And for those of you that have joined here, we'll give it a couple more minutes for the rest of the group to join, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome. We're just going to give it a few more minutes for others to join, and then we'll get started. All right, well, it's a few minutes past the hour here. Why don't we go ahead and wait for one more minute, and then we'll get started. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started here. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dan George. I'm the founder and CEO of Piper Key. We're a people analytics and workforce planning consulting firm based out of Nashville, Tennessee. And joined with us today, we have Francisco Marin from Cognitive Talent Solutions, the co-founder and CEO, and Ronan Conlon from Medtronic, a people analytics professional and practitioner that's been with Medtronic for almost 6 years now in this space. And today we're going to talk about the role of ONA in managing the new normal. But first, I'll give a moment here for Francisco and Ronan to say hello to the group. Francisco.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks to you and to Ronan for being here today. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm happy to see many familiar faces in the webinar, and still there are people joining, actually. But thanks, Herbert from Entity. See you joined. Javi from Dartec Fund and Miguel from Transfer Mapping. Thank you all for joining. So yes, for those of you who don't know me, quick intro about myself. My name is Francisco Marin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cognitive Talent Solutions, also known as CTS. We are a global vendor of organizational network analysis based in New York City. In my case, I was working for 5 years at IBM as business analytics leader for the sales transaction support centers of IBM in Europe. I've been working with CTS for almost 3 years now, and we've been recognized as one of the global top 12 vendors shaping the organizational network analysis space by David Green. And from that top 12, we are one of the only two vendors that work simultaneously with active and passive data sources. So happy to be here today and having the opportunity of sharing our experience in the space.
All right, thank you. And Ronan, why don't you let everyone know?
Thanks, Dan. So as Dan said, Ronan Conlon here, people analytics consultant for Medtronic, who's the world's largest medical device company. And I look after our Asia Pacific and Greater China region based out of Sydney, Australia. And I suppose the reason why I'm delighted to be on the call today is even though I don't work directly in the space of ONA like these two gentlemen, I am a people analytics practitioner who is a real advocate of the technology. I suppose I compare it a bit to sports analytics, which is often a good indicator of what will become popular in the field of people analytics. Human capital data was the primary focus in years gone by. Things like how fast can an athlete run, what is their max bench press. But in more recent times, much more of a focus has been given to network analytics. What movement patterns most likely lead to goal opportunity, what lineup of players concedes the lowest amount of goal opportunities, and so on and so forth. All of this really useful data is something that professional sports teams now invest in as the norm, as they understand that a team is more than just the sum of its parts, and they need to also analyze network analytics of their team to gain other valuable insights in order to gain a more robust and complete picture. I genuinely believe that this is a real opportunity for us in the discipline of people analytics. The primary focus in the past has been on analyzing the human capital data that was readily available. But now with advances in technology and more mainstream awareness of the benefits that investing time and resources into this type of work can have, means that there's never been a better time for organizations to implement this technology. And I feel those that do it right will have a real competitive advantage. So that's why I'm delighted to be here today to talk about this emerging technology with these two gentlemen.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, Ronan, most of us understand that you live in Australia, but that's not probably the typical Australian accent that people are recognizing. Can you explain that a little?
Yeah. Apologies for those that can't understand me. I've been trying to slow down my accent as much as I can, but this is as good as we've got to. But yeah, I've had a very fortunate time with Medtronic. Got to live in many different countries. So Irish originally, where I started out for Medtronic in my hometown of Galway, where we have a large manufacturing base. And I've been lucky enough to be fairly mobile and get the opportunities to be mobile through my organization. So I've worked in Minneapolis, Dubai, and most recently Sydney for the last 3 years. So this is kind of my current abode. Don't know how long I'm going to stay here, but certainly enjoying the lifestyle down under.
Excellent. You've certainly been able to build up your networks all over the globe. So that'll be a perfect intro into our next segment here. So we want to talk about the new normal and how to manage it. And there's plenty of technologies out there that are excellent for this type of thing, but we think ONA really drives that next piece. But before we kind of really start talking about ONA, I wanted to just give a quick definition of what we consider the new normal. And for the most part, we break it down to 4 different aspects, right? So it's timing of phases, the customer demand, a company's operating model, and then the social behaviors. So on timing of phases, right, we've got 3 that I think most people are recognizing. The first one is crisis, which I think, at least for the US and most of the developed countries, we're kind of moving out of crisis and into the adapting phase. And then after the adapting phase is more the normalizing phase. I think some companies or countries are probably in between adapting and normalizing, but the distinguishing qualities between those are kind of blurred as we try to figure out exactly how do we deal with the response of COVID, and even in the US, some of those responses of racial and social unrest. But it still comes down to how do we as people change our working styles for each phase? Now, most of us have gone remote, but some people are now starting to go back to the offices, as well as some of the retail stores are beginning to open again, and that poses different challenges as well. So the next item on here is customer demand. How do you adjust your workforce to meet that demand? How do you know which resources should be working where? How do you know if those resources are working well together? All of these things kind of come together, and especially make it even more difficult to begin to understand is, if there is a resurgence, how do we then begin to change yet again those resources to meet the customer demand? And again, these questions, excellent way to answer them is using ONA, as we'll show here in a few minutes. The third aspect on here is operating model. So many of us have changed how operations exist, right? The sales teams are doing different things. Retail stores are using a lot more plexiglass. Certain things are pickup and drop off only. So how are your organizational changes and workforce changes needed as the operations for each of your groups change? And finally, how do these operations adapt over each phase? How does that adapt if we go back into a resurgence phase? So all these things are questions that we're, as business people, as HR professionals, as operators, are going to need to understand, and that directly reflect how our workforce is directed and managed. And finally, the social behaviors, right? We're constantly trying to be curve conscious. How do we seek to understand the risk tolerances of our customer demand, our community, our stakeholders, and how do that change? How do those tolerances change over time? Specifically speaking, for customers and for employees, as we move through these phases, how do those risk tolerances change for them? And then how do we effectively manage all of those resources and situations? And so kind of finally what we talk about here is, what can actually be controlled, and how do you best communicate effectively with your stakeholders? And I think, as you'll see here in a little bit, we believe ONA can really change and help manage that aspect. But before we get into that, I think we're going to take our first poll. So we've got a few polls here we're going to do today just to get feedback from everyone on the phone. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll here now. All right, the question is, how familiar is your company with organizational network analysis? So we'll give it a few seconds here as people chime in. All right, about halfway there. Wait another couple seconds. All right, we got a few responses here. Let's check in. All right, so on your screen you should see some of the responses. How familiar is your company and organization with organizational network analysis? Again, to be expected, right? The group on this call, most have not really even heard of ONA. I can totally understand that. Really great to see that some use it regularly, and that some of you are close to launching a project or kind of beginning to mention it. That's excellent. Super excited to hear that there's been some progress over the last couple of years. But as you can see, for the most part, it's still somewhat of an untapped resource in corporate organizations right now. All right. So before we kind of hop in a little bit more, I wanted to give a brief overview of organizational network analysis so that people really understand where we're coming from and the kind of basic fundamentals of the technology. And the first thing that we like to point out is typically that everyone understands how work is organized, right? There's a formal hierarchy. You have a boss, you have hopefully some direct reports, and everyone kind of falls in line. But when reality and how you think about what happens next and how that work gets done is really throughout your informal networks. So how is that work accomplished? And one of the things we like to point out here is that for high performers, right, and this is an old Rob Cross paper that was published many years ago that still holds true today, right? High performers leverage their networks, and they gather information and garner support for the things that they're doing in order to move their work along and be successful. And that's what even today holds true for the individuals in your organizations. But as most people probably understand it, everyone's familiar with the human capital side of an individual, right? Their value to the organization is pretty much their skills, their experiences, their tenure, certain places. What have they accumulated that people, for the most part, can see and understand? But what we're really lacking in the total employee value aspect is the social capital, right? All their relationships, their networks, both inside the corporation and outside. How do you build all that together to really say the value of an individual employee? Because certain employees may, for instance, have only 10 years of experience, but are really good at brokering new and innovative information, or taking different aspects of the company and sharing those with the right people in order to kind of build consensus and drive deeper results. Now, for background on ONA, I think there's an important aspect to kind of understand, right? This has existed more or less forever, but with only probably the last 30, 40 years, has it really become somewhat of a visual tool. And the mathematical piece behind it has been there for a long time. Actually was reading a book not too long ago that mentioned it was over 70 years old. But for the most part, graph theory has been around about 30 or 40 years. And it's simply looking at each node's placement on this graph, which you'll see here to the left, right? And that individual graph is built up of vertices and edges, and essentially looks to depict the different relationships between people. Now, what you see here are nodes, right? That's the circles, and I think if you can really zoom in, you can see some triangles, but the people that are more central have higher degree connections. So essentially they're connected to more people, or even the people more central are connected to the other people that are more central. And what's really been useful in the last several years is that more technology and vendors have come out to really show the different size, shape, and color. And to be specific, CTS's technology has been really helpful in being able to understand how those relationships work and the different aspects of what makes ONA a successful or useful analysis tool. So when we look to read the visuals, right, it's not certainly obviously not a number. There are definitely numbers and ratios behind it, but for the most part, it prints these kind of pretty looking visuals and graphs, in which case we look for different types of signatures. And those can be identified as, this first one as a silo signature, right? So you see how this group is kind of segmented off to the side. And that could be good or bad, depending on what the context of that operating structure is. But then there's also an influence signature, right? So someone toward the middle. This individual or team has much more pull and influence on the rest of the organization, and is, or can be, very useful for encouraging innovation and circulating ideas. Now, how do we get to that type of information, right? There's two main ways that we'd go about this. One is an active survey or passive ONA, and that is taking employee metadata, right? So both sources are definitely different and have different aspects, but can provide different types of information. So for the active side, you see that there's surveys or questionnaires, everything's self-reported. It's typically only a snapshot in time, and the surveys overall can have a better idea, or gain a better idea of the context and the relationships that exist, because you can ask specific questions. However, the risks or biases that are there is that certain individuals can select others more frequently, and oftentimes you can get into an area where you get lower response rates, which again don't give you as much information. On the passive side, you're really looking at all the employee metadata. And when we say metadata, we mean anything from Office 365 meetings and emails, Slack, other types of information carriers and communication carriers like Skype. All that can be kind of pulled together and aggregated. And what's great about passive is that you can do this over a span of time, right? Now, the advantages of this is volume and scale. It quickly can scale up to whatever type or size of organization you have, but it doesn't really give or relay much context as to what's happening. You have to kind of dive in and understand what's going on there. And then finally on this side is the privacy concerns that kind of come with passive is something that most organizations are still kind of dealing with is trying to understand what are the kind of privacy gateways that exist, how far can we push, how do we responsibly manage that data? All right, so I know that was a pretty brief overview of that, but want to make sure that we are answering questions. So if you do have any questions, please let us know through the chat and we can try to answer those. Francisco, do you see any big questions that we should answer so far?
Yes, and thanks for the intro, Dan. So we have a question from Mike Brennan. He said, do you have experience leveraging ONA to ID nodes and knowledge brokers who can assist in organizational change management efforts? For example, everyone should get behind this new way of doing things, and here's why we are not using this tool, and here's why you need to use it. So do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, we could. It's actually a perfect segue into our next poll. And then, so why don't we just hold on that real quick and we'll answer that in 1 minute. But I think this next poll really helps out kind of the greater group understand where people can use this. Let me.
Now I can elaborate on a specific case study for change management and even show a demo of how it works.
All right, so this question really asks, where do you think you could apply ONA? And as the person before mentioned, definitely aspects of looking for brokers, other innovators, those individuals that link people from subset to subset to really understand how do you find those either informal leaders or innovators that share information that can get people excited about what to do. And certainly that is one of the best ways to use ONA, because those individuals are often, I think, what most people would identify as sometimes hidden within the organization. They're not always the loudest speakers. They don't always kind of present the big conferences, but at the same time, they're the people that are constantly researching, understanding what's going on in the back of the organization. All right, we got most people to, so end the poll and share the results. All right. So where do you think you could apply ONA? So it looks like the big one here was identifying informal leaders or SMEs. And again, this is one of the best places to do so, because you're not just asking certain leadership and their anecdotal experience with certain people, or you're relying on a skill inferencing methodology. You're literally asking all the peers and hierarchical individuals that are related to people to say, where is this skill set? And again, this is an excellent way for finding out where some of those informal leaders and SMEs are. But certainly don't want to discount the fact that remote workers and looking to accelerate adoptions for processes and policies, again, this is also finding where those informal leaders are, finding out where those brokers are, finding out who those individuals are that can share this type of information. So excellent results there. All right. So now that we've kind of got a little bit of understanding of ONA, we wanted really to have a conversation with Francisco and Ronan about what's really kind of looking forward to how ONA can express or be used. And one of the first things that we've really seen in the past couple months here is the focus on remote working. And I think most of us can define remote working as, or the aspects of it are the collaboration side of it, the isolation side of it. If you've seen or have experienced employees that are burning out or working kind of all the time, right, past normal working hours. And then finally, as we look to onboard new employees, how do we onboard them effectively into an organization that's essentially not there? So Francisco, why don't you give us your thoughts on some of the experiences and use cases you've seen for this remote work aspect?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Dan. And I will try to answer in a way also that addresses some of the questions that we are receiving on the chat. So based on my experience, now that companies are going into this so-called new normal, definitely one of the key factors in that new normal is the increase of remote working. Some companies had more previous exposure than others to remote working, and the transition is being easier for some of them and more difficult for others. But from an ONA perspective, I think that this new normal is not only creating new challenges for companies, but it's also making existing challenges more difficult to manage. For example, when it comes to organizational silos, right? Big companies always had to deal with organizational silos, and every time that they had to implement a strategic change, one of the main challenges that they had to face when it comes to driving adoption was how to deal with these parts of the organization that are only interacting with each other, and where it is more difficult than to implement these strategic changes. So I want to actually show an example in a visual manner with a demo on how ONA can tackle these specific challenges when it comes to organizational silos and bottlenecks. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen very briefly. I don't know if you guys can confirm if you can see my screen now.
You're good.
Yeah, good. Okay, so let's start with organizational silos. This would be an example of how an ONA network looks like. As you were explaining, each node represents an employee. The edges indicate how they interact with each other. And there are two ways on how you can capture the information, either active ONA through an online survey or passive ONA by looking at the APIs from a wide variety of collaborative tools like email, Jira, GitHub, internet, etc. So just for all the people that are now starting to learn about ONA and are wondering, okay, how does that survey look like, right? This is how an active ONA survey look like. It's basically a multi-choice lookup question where employees receive a series of informal interactions. And for example, you're asked to enter the name of the people that share with you information on a regular basis. They need to do your job. So you can either select the name of the people from the drop-down menu, or you can type the name of the people that come to your mind. And this way we can load a lot of information in a very scalable manner. So that's where the data is coming from for active ONA. Then basically, based on the results of the survey, there is a ranking on influence done. And depending on the position that you have in the ranking, you will be categorizing one of the different levels of influence that are typically utilized. In this example, we have central employees, there is the top 20%, intermediary employees, there is the following 60%, and peripheral employees, that are the ones at the bottom 20%, okay? So now, with regards to collaboration and organizational silos, how can companies leverage ONA in the context of the new normal? So one of the things that you can do is actually, you can visualize the results at department level. And this way, for example, now I'm visualizing the results of the maintenance department. You can leverage AI-powered algorithms to identify in real time those organizational silos. So when I click here on Serve Communities, for example, I can see that the algorithm automatically identifies those informal communities that are formed inside of the organization. Here, for example, I can see that the algorithm has identified a community of 4 people that are only interacting with each other, and they're completely disconnected from the rest of the organization. So this is the type of situation that you want to prevent, you want to avoid, or at least you want to get a better understanding of. Sometimes it makes sense because those people are handling confidential information and they are not supposed to interact with the rest of the organization. But sometimes this happens when it's not supposed to happen and you want to implement mitigation actions in a proactive manner. So we have other situation that is that you might identify an organizational silo like this one in yellow color, where we have a person that appears to be acting as a bottleneck. And then again, you want to look at the situation in more detail. And very, very important message about ONA. Never use ONA as a standalone tool. Always use it to integrate social capital metrics into strategic decision making processes. But it's really useful to combine it with other metrics, because otherwise the insight might not be accurate if you don't look at the bigger picture. So once you have identified that bottleneck or person that is acting as a bridge, you can look more in detail into the situation, and see if you have to establish a mitigation action or not. That's when it comes to organizational silos. That again, before you were in the office, you could see those people were all interacting with each other, you know, and you could kind of like identify them with the ONA if you really had a regular contact with them. But now that most people are working from home in the context of the new normal, it is more difficult to do. The same with our onboarding. Onboarding a person in a team that is working remotely is much more difficult than doing so with a team that is working face-to-face. And that process of building team trust and cohesion is more challenging now than ever. So what you can do is you can actually identify the informal leaders in the organization. And the interesting thing here, and this is something that is very well illustrated by the so-called 3% rule that was coined by Innovisor, is that if you're able to identify only 3% of the informal leaders in your organization, and you can position them as early adopters of any strategic change, that 3% can influence up to 85% of the remaining population and can accelerate the adoption of these strategic changes by up to 40%. You can see here when I drag an informal leader, how I can see in a very interactive manner how those people can influence the rest of the organization. But if the people that you position as early adopters of those strategic changes are peripheral employees, they will not be able to spread the adoption of that change no matter how hard they try. So how is this related to onboarding? You can take some of these informal leaders and position them as buddies. So these are people that are exposed to the new hires during the adaptation period. And that way they can shorten the so-called time to productivity, meaning the time that those new hires need to reach an optimal level of performance when compared with more experienced peers. This will also reduce the attrition risk during the first months and will have a positive impact in the overall employee experience. I meet with large multinationals on a weekly basis, and one of the common challenges that I see is we have new hires that are leaving within the first 4 months, you know, and they put a lot of focus on the recruitment stage and what type of people they are selecting as candidates. But part of the problem is the onboarding process in those first 4 months that you spend in the organization. If the person that you're exposed to or the people you're exposed to are people that are informal leaders, that are charismatic and that are aligned with the objectives of the company, it's much more likely that those people are going to reach an optimal level of performance faster, and they're going to be happy in the organization. But if the people they come across are people that are demotivated, that are not going to speak good about your organization, that will also have a very negative impact on the employee experience of those new hires. So that would be a quick summary of how ONA is creating value in the context of the new normal. Later, in order to address some of the questions that we have here, I would like to talk a little bit as well about burnout risk. Is another item that you mentioned. So just to show a graphical example on how burnout risk assessment works. What we do, this will be an example of passive ONA, is that we look at different indicators in the employee's digital footprint. So here, for example, we'll be coloring the employees by their burnout risk and what type of indicators we look at. So we look, for example, at things like the average response time, the percentage of communications sent out, so working hours, percentage of unread emails. In the case of managers, you can look as well whether the managers are scheduling one-to-one meetings with their employees or not. And in the case of Slack, for example, you can actually look at sentiment analysis from the public threads. In general, or at least in our company, we do not look at the content of the communications. We only look at the metadata that you get from the API of the email communication. And in the case of tools like Office 365, for example, you can look simultaneously at the email component, the calendar, and the video conference tool like Microsoft Teams. So you can integrate multiple data sources simultaneously. The other question that we had on the chat was related to how do employees perceive the implementation of passive ONA, the so-called big brother factor, right? Like, is the company watching my moves, right? And how do we handle that potential negative perception that this type of analysis or any people analytics project in general can have on the employees? So first of all, it's very important to communicate clearly the purpose of the project. In the case of the active ONA project, this is typically done through a communication from human resources and along with a message in the survey itself. And in the case of passive ONA, you can look either at opt-in or opt-out features, but also communication from HR always helps. Actually, one of our clients recently launched a survey post ONA implementation, and they saw that actually from a scale of 0 to 5, it was really, really close to 5, being 5 the most positive perception. So the perception of the employees of the active ONA implementation was positive, because they perceived that they were being given a voice in some strategic process. So when they were able to identify those people that were creating value for them on a regular basis, that information was being used when it comes to giving people opportunities in the organization, promotions, leadership development programs, and so on.
Yeah, Francisco, that's a great point. There are definitely aspects of ONA where people can kind of feel like they are participating in something where they don't get a lot of value of. It's just something that management has, and they're the only ones that are going to be able to use it. But I wanted to get Ronan's perspective on this as a practitioner working in a large scale global company. The amount of data that you have access to is there, but sometimes it just may not feel like it's enough in order to answer the questions that the executives are asking. So I wanted to get your kind of perspective on, in this new normal, what are the biggest questions you're getting from your stakeholders and your leadership that other people are probably experiencing as well?
Yeah, so absolutely. Thanks, Dan. So look, I think it was mentioned in the poll, and to refer back to it there, the ongoing kind of COVIDian crisis that we're all trying to work our way through is having long-lasting ramifications, probably primarily in terms of the biggest remote working experiment in history. I also see, though, a huge opportunity for this technology, and I see it in my own organization and across any large multinational, is how we rebound from this crisis, and we look to our organizational design and try to determine which teams are optimized by working together in person all the time, some of the time, and rarely. And I must say, I'm a small bit surprised as some of the kind of materials have come out since the COVID-19 pandemic to see bold announcements from some really large companies still in the crisis, saying that they will operate wholly or mostly remote in the future. I'm not saying by any means that this approach is wrong, but I do think that we should look at the data before jumping into any decisions with this level of impact on the way that we'll do work in the future. I know Satya Nadella from Microsoft has come out and said that from their perspective, they're going to take a cautious approach in terms of any long-term decisions that they'll be making in terms of how they scale out their workforce in the future. Similarly, I was reading an article quite recently from Amazon's People Analytics Chief, Michael Arenas, who suggests that physical proximity matters and is crucial to success. He declared that up to 35% of a team's performance depends on the frequency members engage face-to-face. That's an awful lot of performance to be leaving on the table if we all go to fully remote working. So I really don't think this is a one-size-fits-all, and what will work for one organization or team will not always work for another. I do think that we need to take a step back, though, and look at the data and determine what approach makes the most sense in each instance. That's where I really think the insights we can extract from ONA technology can really support an organization and teams and leaders in making an informed decision and making as informed decision as possible with any of this upcoming organizational design work that will very likely result directly from this COVID-19 pandemic that we're currently working our way through. So I see that as a huge opportunity for this tool to really be leveraged and ensure that we come out of the whole crisis stronger and kind of in a position to move forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll give kind of two quick examples. For those of you kind of still wondering maybe a little bit about the powerfulness of this tool, but yet also some of the ambiguity that comes with it. A good friend of mine who's definitely within ONA, she kind of refers to ONA as sometimes the Google search tool of HR and networks, and such that there's plenty, almost too much information out there, and that without context or a specific problem or issue, ONA can certainly feel very daunting. But once you know exactly the problem or issue that you need to solve for, then ONA can be an incredible tool for helping you figure that out. And a quick example of this is working with a retailer in Charlotte, North Carolina, 40-person team or so with the one store specifically. They throughout the pandemic have been open, but have been trying to figure out how best to execute and change some of their operations to make their customers feel safe, and then also protect their business and their employees. And so in doing so, they had a leadership meeting which said, okay, let's find, let's try to figure out all the ways we can do so. But actually what they did end up using is they kind of worked with myself and another team to build out an ONA structure. And they said, okay, who within the group and team are the kind of informal leaders, the epitome that exemplify great customer service and operations. And so they actually identified a couple of the salespeople that were typically just regularly on the floor, and they brought them into a meeting and asked them, okay, what are the operational changes we can make to give customers a better experience, but also protect ourselves? And they were actually able to come up with much better ideas than the executives could on their own. And had they actually not had this ONA study there, they would have never actually understood that they could have tapped into these resources, figured out these problems, and then ultimately changed their operations and kept their business running throughout the pandemic. So there's a certain layers here of understanding the context, finding out which resources have the best information, and then making sure you tap into those resources by bringing them to either meetings or pulling them into certain conversations where they can be useful. All right, looks like we got a couple questions here. Want to make sure we answer. So, okay, why instead of powerful ONA on LinkedIn, the star performance, the profile for freelancer? So can AI and ONA be better leveraged for searching opportunities for candidates? So for candidates, so that bridges talent pipeline and gap. Certainly, within organizations, I think this probably works a little better, simply because the data from LinkedIn is, well, public, a bit harder to assess, but within companies, there's no doubt a better way to assess who has the skill sets, who has the experience that can be leveraged for this type of information. And so that you're not just asking executives, oh, who should lead this effort? And they kind of point to the person that they either have had one anecdotal experience with or has seen or heard of. They can actually tap into the real truth behind it, which is, again, crowdsourcing the person with the best amount of information or experience so that they can find the right person to do that.
Dan, if I can elaborate a bit on the different questions that we're having on the chat. So just to complement the one that you already covered regarding basically recruiting in the end and selecting potential candidates, right? Definitely, recruitment is one of the hottest area in the hottest areas in HR technology, but from a ONA perspective, it's actually one of the least explored areas. And I see there two potential use cases. So first of all, I think there is a huge potential for to leverage ONA during the academic period of all the employees. So when people are at the university, for example, they are already actually generating social capital that can be evaluated, so that when companies come and select those fresh graduates, they can have actually not only information about their academic performance, but also their social capital. I think there is a huge potential there that is not being leveraged at the moment. Another option is once you are working with candidates and you create, like, for example, teamwork simulation or focus groups, you put those people to interact for a day or for a week and see how they behave. You can actually there integrate organizational network analysis and, again, integrate social capital metrics to enhance the decision-making process related to selecting those successful candidates. There's another question in the chat that I wanted to address. There is from Herbert from Entity. He said, we have now over 40,000 people working remotely in Entity. In the future, we may need to find out even more, where are people more productive? In the office or remote, do you have data about that journey already? Companies who use ONA before or during the COVID situation? Yes, so there is I can share experience both from our company and also other stuff that has been published out there. So I want to quickly point out to some research shared by Worklytics. It's very interesting. They say that since the COVID-19 started, there is a 15% increase in the length of the working day. There is a 17% increase in manager outreach. Also, 25% increase of recurrent meetings, and lower collaboration between the teams, actually lower by 15%. So we see that already working from home is impacting that, the way that teams collaborate with each other and the way that teams works. Other than that, what we see from our experience, from CTI's experience, is that companies are using ONA in two main ways in the context of the coronavirus. The first one is to prevent employee isolation. That is the use case that I covered before. So now we have employees working from home, how can we prevent that these employees will become disconnected from the team, and that's part of managing the productivity of those employees working from home. The other use case, actually, and it's a little bit more sensitive, has to do with implementation of quarantine actions. So companies, some of them have formularies in place where employees are proactively and voluntarily reporting that they have either symptoms of COVID-19 or that they have been infected with COVID-19. And companies can actually leverage ONA data, both active and passive, to establish quarantine actions in a more precise and effective manner. And this is a serious issue for the companies, because if an employee has to leave temporarily the job because of COVID-19, you're talking about 14 to 21 days that employee is not going to work, and that has a cost in lack of productivity for the company. So those are some of the use cases that we are seeing at the moment. And when it comes to companies that were previously using active ONA, I would like to share just very, very quickly one case study. I don't know if you can see again my screen. Can you confirm, Dan, please?
Yep. Very,
very quickly. This is a agro-industrial corporation with 45,000 employees, pretty similar to the size of Entity. They wanted to implement SAP, the SAP platform. So they had appointed a series of change facilitators that had been working for a number of months. So they ran ONA, and what they discovered is that some of these change facilitators were actually being perceived as subject matter experts of SAP, and they were having a high performance, those that we see on the right. But there were other change facilitators that actually were having a low performance. They didn't have as many connections. And you can see the difference. These are the ones on the left. You can see the difference between their network and the network of the high performance ones. So what they did is that they either replaced or complemented those low performing change facilitators with other informal leaders that had been identified through the analysis. So this would be a real case study on a company implementing ONA in the context of a large scale change management exercise. So I think that's from my side, just to cover some of the questions.
Yeah. I think, let's see. I think we might have, so I believe Sushi had asked about if the ONA technologies can capture demographic, geographical, and cultural information in regards to kind of change impacts and its evaluation. And I kind of mentioned yes, but Francisco, didn't know if you could elaborate a little bit more there. And
yes, so a common mistake that companies do when implementing ONA, especially active ONA, is to try to integrate polls questions or engagement questions in the survey. So really, an active ONA survey is a different exercise than a poll survey or an engagement survey. And if you put too many questions in the survey, that will impact in a negative manner the level of participation. So in our case, we have introduced data about demographics in the survey only when the company didn't have that data available with a good level of quality. But otherwise, it's always better to integrate that at a later stage. in the platform as such, once you visualize the results, you can definitely include information about demographics, but always respecting GDPR. So for example, if you show information about age, you should put that information at aggregate level. So not to put, for example, somebody is 25 years old, but somebody is between 18 and 30 years old, for example, right? And then from GDPR perspective, very important, you need to ensure that the employee provides consent to participate in the survey, that the employee can revoke the consent at any time, and that the employee can also download the data that is being captured in both PDF and JSON format. Those are some of the actions that are typically taken.
Excellent. I believe we have one more poll I wanted to try to get out here before we close out for today. So this one, which stakeholders would benefit from an organizational network analysis the most? And this is really your best guess. So we have HR leaders, operational leaders, C-suite or senior executives, managers of people, and then individuals. All right, so it's great.
Oh, these are actually very, very interesting results, right? Because I would say that 99% of the conversations out there that take place out of ONA is with HR stakeholders. So I think there is a great opportunity for operational leaders, for senior executives, outside of HR as well, right? And for managerial roles to act as internal champions of ONA projects. I think that's definitely one of the challenges of people analytics in general.
I want to get kind of Ronan's perspective on some of this. So Ronan, as you've kind of been at Medtronic for almost 6 years now, when you kind of embark on some of these projects, is it mostly for HR, or do you actually mix in with a lot of the other operational executives as well? Where do you see most of your people analytics projects going toward?
Yeah, so I suppose in my own personal role, I'm very much a kind of people analytics consultant, so it would be linking with my HR business partners and those try and answer their questions and their business problems in that regard. And I do my best to be as kind of forward or as business thinking as possible. But in terms of this actual poll question, I'm delighted to see the responses being in favor of the kind of managers of people and operational leaders. Just from an industry perspective, I see a lot of the attention being, as Francisco said, on the impact that ONA can have on HR or at the organization at a macro level. But I personally see a huge opportunity there from the employee value proposition, or indeed the manager or people leader benefit in terms of, particularly when we look at the new normal, as we've captured today's session. We know that leaders are going to need to improve their digital management skills or how they manage networks of teams remotely versus the traditional leadership styles. That's just one example where I think ONA and the platform of ONA, with the right kind of nudges and data insights, could really help a manager or people leader to move forward with some of that digital leadership. And delighted to see that the responses and the participants on today's call are acknowledging that as a unique value proposition of this technology, and not just from a HR perspective or from a big brother organizational perspective, but also from the employee and people leader side. So I think that's really positive.
That is great. Yeah, I totally agree on that aspect. Definitely agree. And I think that's where part of the struggle, I think, for some organizations, especially where ONA is being kind of pushed out by HR professionals, is kind of getting those operational and senior executives on their side, just to be able to explain the technology and pitch some of these projects that, again, useful for the organization, not just for HR. All right.
And there's an additional question that we haven't addressed yet.
Okay, great.
Just very, very quickly. It's from Sunil Meharia. Said, how do you understand the sentiment of the employee without looking into the mail communication content? So
that's a good one.
Yes, it's a good one. By default, we do not perform sentiment analysis on email because we do not look at the content. The only scenario where we look at the content is with Slack, because the API of Slack allows you to look at the content from public threads, but not private threads. So that communication that is already in the public channels is already available to all the people. So typically there is not really much issue looking at keywords or looking at the overall sentiment there, because in any case, it's information that is open to the whole company, it's very transparent. But in the case of email communication, we do not look into neither sentiment or tone or any type of natural language processing.
Great. Let's see. Well, we've got a couple more minutes here, and I think why don't we launch this last poll? Because I think, again, I really want to reiterate a focus on, you know, kind of exactly what you were just talking about. You know, some of the security and issues kind of surrounding what it is, and find out where people think they have the most risk or just concern. So what concerns or reservations do you think your organization would have surrounding ONA? We have privacy of data, use of information against people, so kind of bad actors, compliance with legal part of the organization. We all have been probably part of an organization where legal you know, definitely plays a big part, or is it cultural? Or how comfortable are they to share this type of information? All right, let's see what we got here. So about even on, yep, privacy, and people are afraid that they're going to use that information against them. It is a very realistic reaction to how some of this plays, and I think that's where a lot of or it sits within, you know, project management, the stakeholders within the projects to really drive how this information is going to be used, make sure that it's protected and only available to those individuals that need it for very specific use cases. Francisco, I know you can add a layer on top of that.
Yes, and it's I think that the two concerns that appear on the top positions pretty much reflect the conversations that we have on a regular basis with companies, right? And just to elaborate a bit on that, not only with ONA, but with any people analytics project in general, you have an concern about data privacy. I would say is even stronger in Europe because GDPR is more exigent than other data privacy regulations, but it's a common topic across all continents. So I think as I mentioned earlier, communication is key. If you are transparent with employees about the exercise that is being done and they understand that is being done to help them, then data shows that they have a positive perception from that implementation. On the other hand, before when we were showing the tool, you could see that there was information at employee level, there was information that was sensitive, right? Even if it was aggregated to some extent. So in order to be able to leverage actionable insights, but at the same time protect the privacy of the employees, in our case, what we do is that we give access to all the results to a very limited number of people, typically people in the people analytics or HR department. We're talking about 1 to 5 employees maximum. And then we leverage a system of email nudges to provide actionable insights to the different managers across the organization. In the case of Active ONA, by sharing a report with the insights that are related to their reports, or in the case of Passive ONA, giving these emails on a regular basis. So you would receive an email and the email would say, look, these are 3 people in your team that have high risk of burnout. Here are some of the actions that you can take. Here are 3 people that you can potentially use as change facilitators, or these are 2 people that can potentially be used as buddies to accelerate the time to productivity of new hires. So through these email nudges, the goal is to share only actionable insights and with the right stakeholders, and only sharing with them the information that is relevant to their teams, right? And typically this is a step-by-step process. Typically, you would share first the reports with the high-level executives. Once they have a certain level of exposure to it, you would go up to lower levels and typically shared with managerial stakeholders. There are some tools out there, for example, My Analytics from Microsoft, that actually share insights with the employees themselves, showing, you know, like, who are the employees that you interact the most on a weekly basis. But we think it's important as well to engage managerial stakeholders, because in the end, especially the center of gravity of the employee experience takes place in the relationship between the non-managerial employee and the immediate supervisor. That's the area where you have to make sure that the right information is available in a user-friendly manner.
Most definitely.
But in the end, you know, it's a common concern that nowadays most companies have, and I think that the companies and the professionals working in the ONA field, we have to also elaborate, you know, and communicate what are the best practices when it comes to data privacy to create the right standards, right? So the best practices are available, and by default they will be implemented. And if it's possible to implement them as an error-proofing solution, meaning, you know, that when you implement the ONA initiative through the platform, you automatically have to use those best practices. That would be the best scenario.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we're about out of time today, but I want to thank specifically Ronan and Francisco and everyone that was able to join today. Really appreciate you taking the time to work with us and hear us talk about kind of ONA, the next normal, or the new normal, however we are referring to it these days. But again, appreciate everyone for attending, and please reach out to us if you have further questions. On that note, we'll end the call and see you guys later.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.